Hello, everybody. I think people are still joining, so I'm going to give it another minute before I get started. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'm Tracy Kearns. I am the current president of the New England chapter of um, APOR, and I want to welcome you to our fall webinar, which is a lively discussion on the perils of misinformation in public opinion, politics, and policy. Today, we have with us leading the discussion, Meg Heckman, who is the Associate Professor at Northeastern University School of Journalism and Media Innovation. A nice little touch, Meg is also an alum of the University of New Hampshire and the UNH Survey Center where we are at. So Meg will be moderating the discussion with our distinguished panelists who we have joining us today. We have Ashley Kurzinger and James Fahey, and I believe Paul Mihalidis will be here, but late. So I apologize for that. But why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm going to hand it over to you, Meg, to get this discussion rolling.
Well, Tracy, thanks so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here, and I am quite excited to hear from and learn about the work that the panelists are doing. As a journalism professor who also still occasionally practices journalism, I care very much about combating mis and disinformation. So I think this is really important work, and I am honored to be here. So the panelists that we have today have really interesting and vast experience in different areas like health policy, politics, and media. So I thought a good way to get started would be to have each panelist introduce themselves and then talk briefly about how the dynamics around misinformation are unfolding currently in their area of expertise. So I was going to start, I'm just going to start with who is in the upper left-hand corner of my screen, and that is James. Would you please go first? Thank you.
All right, great. It's lovely to be here with all of you as well. So I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of North Florida. Most of my work focuses on why people hold anti-democratic attitudes and what we can do to fix those. Of course, one thing that really gets in the way of democracy is when we don't have a shared understanding of the truth, and misinformation can really challenge that. So that's sort of how I look at this. So in terms of politics, luckily there's no misinformation floating around in politics and everything is going totally fine. So this is not much of a problem. Of course, that's not the case. And so I'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of misinformation in political science, which really is most inspired by essentially the psychological literature. So in behavioral political science, we tend to think of misinformation as misinformed beliefs, and people are misinformed when they confidently hold wrong beliefs at odds with the best evidence available. And so I kind of took this as my jumping off point. So taking the definition of confidently held beliefs, I think political science is interested in three big questions currently. How do people come to hold beliefs that are wrong confidently? How can we intervene so people don't hold those beliefs? And by the way, are we sure that they actually hold those beliefs anyway, or is that mostly a function, or at least partially a function, of measurement error? So in terms of why people hold these beliefs, mostly I'll talk about the psychological drivers of that, because I'm going to leave things like media effects to experts that are on this panel that know a lot more about media effects. Most work in poli-sci is kind of built on the foundational study of Kunda and motivated reasoning. So this idea that generally speaking, when people process information, they have end goals that they're trying to achieve, and they're going to interpret information in light of that goal. Right now in political science, that goal, at least in American politics that we think of, is basically reaffirming your partisan identity. That is one of our primary drivers of misinformation, that people have these identities that they want to confirm, that they want to accord with, that they want to take in information in a way that makes those identities look good. And so that's, directionally motivated reasoning. People have some goal they want to get to, and they're interpreting all that information in light of the goal they want to get to, rather than whether or not that information is actually credible or not. And one of the big problems that we face is that whenever anyone encounters information, they have a really immediate affective response to this information. So they immediately have some negative or positive response to it. And all other information processing is colored by that initial response. So we tend to think that people believe misinformation because it accords with some pre-existing belief or affect. So as a result, correcting it becomes really difficult. So thinking of our kind of like second main topic about correcting misinformation, there's kind of two mechanisms. One is get to them before they hear the misinformation in the first place, which I think probably fellow panelists can talk a lot about, and we generally think that's more effective. And then there is, can we shift people's incentives so that they start to think of accuracy and truth as like a useful pursuit in and of itself? So the work on misinformation that I tend to engage in tends to look at whether or not we can correct information basically through surprising corrections. So looking at once individuals have a misinformed belief, it's very, very difficult to correct it. Some of the ways that you can correct it are cognitively based, and others are sort of behaviorally. So in terms of a cognitive correction, like one might be you have some misinformed belief. Let's say you think that George Bush orchestrated 9/11. One way I might try and correct that misinformation is to give an alternate correct explanation of that event, explain why that's more reasonable, and sort of basically try to replace that belief. Now that has had really mixed evidence on whether or not it's effective. So some other things that we've been trying go along more of that behavioral route. So let's say you believe, misinformation about the 2020 election. So hearing someone correct that misinformation that you trust, that has a high degree of source credibility, that is congruent with your partisanship. So in this case, it would be maybe like a Republican telling you that this election was not rigged, that these beliefs that you have are not accurate. Those are, I think, the most kind of promising methods that we have moving forward, is kind of recognizing that we can't fix this trigger affective response and try and figuring out how can we leverage people's identities in order to correct that misinformation. So I'll end with the third big thing that I think is going on in politics or in political science and misinformation, and that is a measurement error question, which is, I'm sure, is the most exciting thing you can hear, right? Measurement error. But this is the case that, and you might have this feeling sometimes when you're talking to someone where they'll express some belief and you'll think, how could you possibly think that is true? Like, surely that is not deeply held. You're actually doing something else with that belief. And we have some examples of this in political science where people are knowingly providing misinformation in response to survey questions. One really famous example of this is an experiment by Schaffner and Lux, who showed that if you show people two pictures of crowd sizes and you ask them which one is larger, they will correctly identify the larger crowd size. But if you tell them, by the way, these are both from an inauguration, and one of them is Obama's inauguration and one of them is Trump's inauguration, some sector of Trump supporters will then pick the Trump inaugural crowd size as larger, even though it is demonstrably smaller. So we know that sometimes people are not even answering what they know to be true. And there are some work, and a lot of my work looks on how we can sort of tease that out, what degree these people really believe this misinformation, and thus how that can be corrected or how those beliefs can be reduced. But overall, in poli-sci, we're mostly thinking about misinformation through the lens of identity, strong, mostly partisan identity.
That's great. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So next up, Ashley, would you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how your work intersects with today's theme?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like James unintentionally set me up really well. So I appreciate all of that. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. I'm thrilled to be here. I am the Director of Survey Methodology and Associate Director of Public Opinion and Survey Research at KFF. For those of you that don't know much about KFF, we're a nonprofit organization that conducts policy research, journalism, and polling, mostly centered in the health policy space. For the past several decades, we've been providing, our goal has been to be providing reliable, accurate, and nonpartisan information to help inform health policy in this country. In the past several years, I mean, to say that misinformation in the health space has always been there is an understatement of the century. And I'll give some examples, but in recent years, we've really seen it exacerbated. And this especially became true during the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine rollout. And so we decided to pivot some of our work during this time, because it wasn't that misinformation was new in the health space, but it was becoming so easily accessible and disseminated that we thought it was important for us to pivot from just moving from measuring prevalence of misinformation to really designing research to help understand the broader dynamics of misinformation in this space. So earlier this year, we designed a program and launched it aimed at both identifying and tracking the rise and prevalence of health-related misinformation in the US, and with special focus on communities that are most adversely impacted by health and misinformation. So our efforts have really been twofold. So we've been running a health misinformation tracking poll, which examines the public's media use and trust in sources of health information, and then also measures the reach of specific false and inaccurate claims surrounding health-related topics. And I'll talk a little bit about those. And then the second piece that we've been doing in this space has been tracking current health misinformation messages. And so we're using that to feed into the topics that we're then asking about in our polling. So, right, so a little bit of a media monitor to understand what health misinformation messages are out there, and then how the public is engaging with those. And so what are we seeing in this space right now? I think, and this is the part that James kind of set me up really well, is that hearing is not necessarily believing. We're seeing really high incidence of adults saying that they've heard or read many false and inaccurate health claims, but relatively small shares of the public then believe this misinformation, right? So to get from the point where that they're hearing this to moving it to a misinformed belief, there is a gap there in what we're seeing. So prevalence is high, but maybe the absorption is a little bit lower than kind of this big scary messages that have been out there. Moreover, we are finding that most adults, or some adults, when presented with false inaccurate information, very few of them say that they believe this to be definitely true, right? So there's a much larger share that say that's probably true or that they aren't sure. And that is what we're calling the malleable middle. And we find that this group, right, the ones that haven't kind of moved into these strongly held beliefs, is where intervention could be the most impactful. And so these are people that say that they're probably true, probably false, or they don't know. And so, you know, while exposure to misinformation may not necessarily convert the public into ardently believing false health claims, it's likely adding to confusion and uncertainty in an already super complicated public health space and topics and things that people don't know a lot about. And we are expecting them to be experts on really complicated scientific and medical issues. And so it's kind of just adding to the confusion in that space. So anyways, like this malleable middle, we're finding provides an opportunity for tailored interventions. And so the tailored interventions is, I think, what's really important is when we look at trusted messengers of who is going to be most pervasive or persuasive for groups. It's not a one size fits all. It's very different messengers for different populations, especially if you look at communities that are most adversely impacted, right? So within the Black community, a very different messenger than within the Hispanic community versus within the white community or within low income populations. And so really thinking about the types of messengers that are the most trusted sources of information within that community. We know, for example, one of the things that we found during the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccine rollout is that there was high levels of vaccine, not resistance, but hesitancy among Black and Hispanic adults. And that's because of an understandable and historical distrust with healthcare providers and doctors, and a lack of familiarity with the healthcare settings, right? Because of this historical racism and discrimination that has taken in that place. And so thinking about the different types of communicators that we're going to need to go into those communities and talk about whether getting a vaccine was going to be right for them and their family members, right? So that's one example of how these messengers need to be different based on what we're measuring as the most trusted sources of information in that space. The other piece that I want to make sure that I talk about, and there's so much more I can talk about, but that partisanship and sources of news go hand in hand. It's really hard to tease them out because, as all media scholars know, and most people in this webinar know, we have such different sources of information. So it's hard to say, like, if you are someone that's getting your news from OANN, right, that you're more likely to believe misinformation, and that's different than Republicans, because it's Republicans that are more likely to be going to those news sources. And so really teasing out where the news environment plays with partisanship, I think is really important. And maybe I'll stop there and just looking forward to this discussion.
Right, fantastic. And last but certainly not least is Paul. Paul, if you could please take a minute or two to introduce yourself and then give us a broad overview of how your work intersects with questions around misinformation. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Meg. And it's great to be with everybody today. So my name is Paul Mihailidis. I am a professor of civic media and journalism at Emerson College up in Boston, Massachusetts. And I have spent a majority of my career at the intersection of looking at media interventions and how they help communities advocate for needs, or the relationship between media literacies and active and participatory citizenries or communities. So, and today's topic is a fascinating one, and I hope my colleagues here set such a wonderful and in-depth stage. I perhaps will spend my time offering some insights into recent research that I've been doing, and hope it might add a little bit of a context, just building off of what I heard James and Ashley talking about, and maybe providing a little bit of a different understanding of the media and institutional aspect to this, and a little bit of a kind of a theoretical entryway as well. So I think I'd like to add in here that the problem, so some of the more recent research that we've been doing it has been around the spatial concept of distance and civic distance. And I'd like to just start there as an entryway into thinking about kind of some of the more conceptual groundings into misinformation space. So I will say a couple of attributes to this. Obviously one is our media infrastructures and our media institutions, right? There's kind of been I think in the United States context, all of the kind of research that looks into trust of our public institutions shows that those levels are declining. And in media institutions, it's been very acute. We've also seen a kind of a relative distribution in terms of where people are finding their information and how that information is structured. So a large study done a few years ago showed that people are now, deep into internet subcultures to find out news, and they're turning towards kind of what we would call digital alternative sources as much as they are to traditional legacy sources. Now, as legacy sources have become more deregulated and privatized, the amount of content that they're showing has become more and more, I think, one-sided or polarized itself, but alternative sources lead to this. So as Ashley was saying, this has consequences into our ability to have cohesive structures, right? And I think that it's the kind of notion of trust in this space and where we affiliate towards what media organizations. Another big side of this before I hop into the distance part has been the hollowing out of our local media infrastructures as a big, as leaving kind of a big hole in terms of how communities find reliable information and use that to have cohesive civic discussions across differences, right? So like James was talking about, we do know that people's affiliation, their own kind of self-identities and values and beliefs, they usually find information to validate those before they go looking for neutral information to make decisions about, right? And I do agree with Ashley very much that this isn't so black and white that this misinformation makes sense, but implicitly, we all do this, and I think we'd all do this on this Zoom screen too, is implicitly affiliate with information that aligns with our values and belief systems first. Now, the step is, how do we go from that to then reasoning in a kind of a more nuanced way about how this information affects our beliefs? And I think a big part of this is that when your media infrastructures and daily media environments become hollowed out, and you're reverting to these platforms and technologies that have very different value systems than the one we're talking about, it's not that misinformation becomes pervasive, it's that we rely on tools and technologies that prioritize the skimming along and the consistent distraction and the elevation of information without veracity or credibility. And news organizations have played far into this. So the biggest media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal that we would assume are kind of the lasting vestigials of true credible information, they are as much, if not the most, to blame for the hollowing out of local media infrastructures because of their tactics as digital media enterprises. I think this is a really important considerations for us to have when we're considering about the perils of misinformation. And I do agree that we can look at consumer individual behavior and individual needs, but we should look at the structural conventions within which our media organizations operate. So when you don't have like the local media infrastructure is there to provide you with that very grassroots level connectors into those issues, you end up being extrapolated towards national issues and national politics, which we know is very reductive. And if it's reductive in platforms and social media spaces, the research we've been doing the last years around this has shown that people will just start to slowly accumulate that sentiment around the information. It's not that they're, oh, these lies are great, or I believe in this, and this is how it is, right? So, and I want to just bring this back into this concept of distance that I started with. A recent report I've just finished writing for the Kettering Foundation, talking about restoring civic health, and it outlines this kind of the growing culture of distance in everyday life. Is that really what we've found with a research project that's been ongoing for a few years now, is that as people get removed from the proximal environments that connect them to civic life, that allow them to engage in nuance of ideas or in the rigors of human interactions, they rely on these media spaces more. They don't become maybe slightly susceptible, but they simply are caught up in the norms and values of those media institutions, and they're not finding that available cognitive space to be engaged in the necessary kind of human engagements that allow for them to reinvest in the local, to find a lot of space in restorative civic practices about being with others in conversation, and them trying to make decisions on information without really considering the credibility of it, but mostly if it aligns with their beliefs and if it's enough to allow them to feel cognitively filled a little bit. And I think, just the last things I'll say about this is that slowly over time, when we've inserted distance into the proximal environments and the institutions we need, that accumulates and it creates a deficit, right? That we have less time to spend in those spaces. And as a result, misinformation can become more pervasive because we're in spaces where misinformation is allowed to be more pervasive. And excuse the language, and it's not misinformation as lies, but it's that kind of bullshit versus lies distinct that Henry Frankfurt made about it's just an obscuring of what's true and not an intentional lie in most cases. So I'll say I'll end there and look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely fascinating overviews from all of our panelists. There seemed to be a pretty clear through line of the challenges around a lack of trust and a lack of connection in society. And that's a really big problem and a big quasi-existential question. And it can often feel really overwhelming to try and push back against misinformation. That said, I've definitely heard some success stories, and I think our participants might like to hear about some success stories too. So if each of you could please take a minute or two to talk about something that's working or maybe might work in the future, that would be fantastic. Any volunteers to go first? I feel like I'm cold calling a class full of undergrads if I just start picking. So
I can go first.
All right, great, thank you.
I was always the undergrad that raised my hand, so this feels
Same.
on brand. Okay, so we started thinking about success stories. Unfortunately, I just came up with non-success stories. I was like thinking back of, especially in the health space, right? The false link between MMR vaccines and autism, conspiracy theories around HIV and AIDS epidemic, the myth of detransitioning among where trans people regret medical interventions, all of these kind of like pervasive pieces of misinformation. And I was like, I know I can come up with this success. And so I think I maybe found one, but it might be a stretch. So if we think back to kind of the peak ACA time when the death panels, some people may be too young to remember the death panel discussion, but this was the idea around the ACA that the government was going to set up these panels to make end-of-life care decisions for people on Medicare. That was seen as like government overreach in this space. And so back in like the peak ACA debate, I went back to our polling, when it was just 6 months of being implemented, about 3 in 10 thought that the public was, or that the government was creating these panels. We asked it just recently again, it's declined to about 8%. So maybe that's a success story. I don't know, it seems like a reach, but anyways, I think what we know is like the approaches that are working is that there has to be not only just combating these false health claims, but reinforcing accurate information. And I think this is what Paul was talking about a little bit, is like that you have to not only put out or say what's wrong, inaccurate, but you have to then replace it with what is the accurate information around this. And so I think this is what happened around the death panels discussion, is that instead of, they're not going to set up these death panels. That's not what the government's doing, right? That was the initial kind of messaging around it. But then as the ACA became the law of the land and it got implemented, you're seeing how it actually is happening in day-to-day decisions. And so the false information is kind of going away because people are having true experiences with the ACA that is replacing that. So I think that kind of gives a good example of how you can, we should be giving sufficient attention to both addressing the skepticism and also how we can encourage the displaying of accurate information in this space. So.
Great. James, Paul,
James,
go ahead.
I can
Fantastic.
go next. I kind of thought I would go second because then someone could say something positive and I could, admit that not a lot works. But unfortunately, Ashley did not really set me up there. So I will say that generally speaking, the sort of misinformation that I tend to study, which is, conspiracy theories, like political conspiracy theories, those are notoriously difficult to correct because they're self-sealing, right? Any attempt to correct is further information of the grand conspiracy. And a lot of the misinformation that we currently face, at least in politics, is conspiratorial in nature. And that can be particularly difficult to undo. But I searched high and low, and I thought, what's sort of effective. And there was this recent strengthening democracy challenge out of Stanford with 150 co-authors testing 25 different interventions to try to reduce partisan animosity and anti-democratic attitudes. These are not necessarily misinformation in themselves, but we know these are incredibly highly correlated. And one of the interventions that was really successful was a video of two candidates for governor in Utah, a Republican and the Democrat, doing a joint campaign ad where they talked about how, in very classic Utah politics style, while we disagree, we can be not disagreeable. This is the importance of civic ideals. And seeing both of those two together, ending the ad with, "And we pledge to respect the results of the election," was one of the most effective at reducing partisan animosity. And so I think that sort of strategy can probably be applied towards misinformation correction. I think people have talked a lot about source trust. And so what's really happening there is that there's a lot of signals when you see a bipartisan group of people engaging in something, that this is a source that you should trust. Both because your own people are saying it and these other, this opposing group is agreeing. And so that's also sort of surprising. And so it seems very, very trustworthy. And so I think that to the degree that we can get surprising sources, diverse groups of people, messengers that kind of fit with specific communities, as Ashley has mentioned previously, I think that is a promising avenue for misinformation correction.
Great. Paul, would you like to pick up on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I was always the last person to raise my hand as an undergrad, so this actually works perfect. I think I'll offer just I think up here in Massachusetts, one thing we've been studying and have actually been involved with on a very local level is there's been a solid initiatives to reestablish local news and media ecosystems. And there's, right now there's a host of these examples. Obviously, I think we've all heard about the set of foundations that have come together and put a whole host, $500 million on the table to do this. But in a few towns outside of the greater Boston area for the last 2 years, there has been a kind of reestablishment. And in some cases, there's been a few local news outlets, and they have these really interesting models of free weekly papers in the mailbox of every citizen, reporters that are focusing, and then using young people in schools. They have a whole host. And then the nonprofit model of a certain percentage coming from local business advertisers, and then contributions. And they've been around for a couple of years, and we've started to study some of the communities where they are and talking to people. And we've seen a few really amazing things, is that there's the need for these has shifted people away from relying on platforms to get local news. So, we're seeing a reestablishment of connections to school committees and local politics. And we've seen a commitment to actually individual and family-based support for these. I think part of the kind of pushback to the last 5 to 10 years of feeling very kind of tarnished by always having to be in this kind of spectacle state of very high, kind of very highly polarized and sensational political information has cumulatively affected people and kind of even with local politics, people's opinions, this and that, spreading information right or wrong about local issues. So, and in these places where local news, that's kind of healthy, in a few towns near where I live, and we started to do research, it's been 3-4 years of these initiatives, and we have seen now starting to see communities investments have increased, and we've seen less, at least in it, this is very initial baseline studies that we've been doing to establish what might be larger studies in terms of just people more committed to connecting in this way. And I do think that for me, if you kind of extrapolate out to what James is studying, on a very local level, I think you start to see reform in behavior and attitude around this. And maybe that's the way it scales up into the more kind of national rhetoric that is a bit harder to get your head around. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Paul. And I don't know if your research has perhaps found this, but we've noticed I'm right up the street. Paul and I are right up the street from each other. He's at Emerson, I'm at Northeastern. We've noticed an increase in those hyper-local news organizations that want to hire our students. And they're often really interested in hiring students who are from the community. And I will be very interested to see what sort of long-term effect that has on trust. If you're hiring, if you're hiring your neighbor's kid to cover City Hall or Town Hall, does that help build trust and relationships? And I just think it's a really interesting dynamic, and I'm glad you're doing work in that area. Oh, sure, go ahead.
Just one quick follow-up, and this is super important. I'm sorry, Meg, to stop a transition. That was a well-timed transition I interceded on. But what's really fascinating about this is reinvesting in the local community is super important. So most secondary spaces have, kind of have local active media outlets, and it's a learning. So the idea that they start covering soft news, sports, art, culture, that has been one of the most popular things you've seen. And it keeps them connected into the community, and it keeps the community. It just, there's seems to be a multiplier effect into community interest in this. And the question will be tipping into the more political, kind of financial, but we have seen it in the soft news cultivating community connections. It's already happening.
Excellent. So before we turn things over to the audience for questions, technical note about that first. Everyone in the audience, you can put questions into the chat, and I will ask them of the panelists in a few minutes. So if you put things into the chat, I will see them and summarize and share with our panelists. Oh, I'm sorry, not the chat. The Q&A tool. You should have access to a separate Q&A tool as opposed to the chat. And when you put questions in there, I will be able to see them. And you should be able to see it at the bottom of the screen for those of you who are perhaps not familiar with this interface. But while everyone is thinking of questions to ask our amazing panelists, I have one final thing I'd like to touch on. The 2024 election cycle is upon us, and I don't want anybody to make predictions. We're a year out, so that's probably not a good idea on a lot of levels, but I would like to hear your thoughts on what role you see misinformation playing in public opinion in the arena of the 2024 election cycle. Anyone want to go first?
I mean,
James, thank you.
Yeah, I suppose this is like technically my domain of expertise. So they say. I'll start off with a contrarian take, or maybe it's not a contrarian take, which is I don't think that misinformation will play a huge role in the 2024 campaign in terms of how people decide to cast their ballot. So not to say that it won't play a massive role in how the campaign unfolds, but when it comes to this presidential race, we have two extremely familiar candidates, and people already have very well-formed opinions when it comes to these candidates. And there was a recent very, very large study in the 2020 election by Alexander Kopik and some other co-authors that found results that are pretty consistent with the existing literature, which is that fact checks of misinformation, at least in politics, improve people's belief accuracy, but have essentially zero effect on people's attitudes. So let's say you don't like Joe Biden, and then one of the reasons you give is that you think he's like secretly a blood-sucking vampire. If I give you information that shows that that's not true, and then you take on that information, you still don't tend to change your attitudes towards Joe Biden because that's probably not the causal pathway there. you don't take in misinformation about a candidate and that causes you to dislike them. You dislike them and then you are susceptible to misinformation about a candidate. And I think that's probably one way where even though misinformation about politics gets a lot of attention, it might be far more influential on things that people have less well-formed opinions about. And like things like vaccines, things like local topics, like where people don't have those well-formed opinions, that's actually, I think, where misinformation can be the most dangerous.
I am gonna be the contrarian to James here and say that I agree around the role of misinformation and evaluation of candidates. But I am very worried about the role of misinformation around issues that may be impacting people's decisions about whether to turn out to vote and who they vote for, specifically abortion. There is so much misinformation and lack of knowledge around abortion policy and procedures in this country. You know, it's now most, you know, the landscape post Dobbs, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe got rid of the federal establishment for abortion in this country, and now it has moved to the states. And so the landscape is changing. It changed drastically in 18 months post Dobbs, and it's kind of slowed down a little bit, but people aren't aware whether abortion is available to them. They don't know what the time limits are, and most people, if they have not had to themselves access an abortion or had a very close person in their lives that had to access an abortion, they don't understand, you know, what medication abortion is, how medication abortion is different from Plan B. They are very different things that do very different, that are very different timed interventions. They don't know that the majority of abortions in this country are now performed using medication. And so that kind of lack of knowledge and lack of awareness makes an environment that's very ripe for spread of misinformation. And we know that abortion can impact maybe not people's decision on who they're going to vote for, but whether they turn out to vote. So if we're seeing pervasive misinformation around abortion policy and procedures in this country, I could see that playing a big role in the 2024 election.
Great. And then just Paul, before you dive in and answer that, I just want to remind folks that that Q&A interface is open. Please put any questions that you have in there for the panelists. Comments are also welcome, and we can riff off of those. So Paul, please go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll just be brief and I acknowledge both the existence of both of these ideas will happen, but and also, you know, for me, it's really about, you know, it is really about the kind of, it's about the information ecosystems and how those play out with voters. It's not we're not reducing misinformation to intentional actors are going to create lies and share them. What will happen is that there will be misinterpretations, exaggerations, the whole idea of like, it's not a direct lie, but there will be some blurriness of what's true and not true because issues are like that. And when they're put into environments where they're reduced to short comments and quick snippets and videos, and then those are propelled everywhere because that's what motivated in the system, then you have this environment where, of course, misinformation will play around certain issues, but for the most part, people will find the information that they already align with and then share that out to constituencies that they already align with. So we're going to be somewhere in between. There's going to be targeted misinformation around issues that are really hot button around presidential. Those will affect outliers. But you know, for the most part, as long as we're still funneling most of our information and communication routines in these spaces, we will have a similar environment to that we've had in the past because we haven't actually regulated or reformed anything in these platforms. They're just going to keep sharing information. And until we have solid alternatives, I don't think that TV news is solid alternative. And it doesn't seem to play that way either. I think we're going to have a similar, you know, kind of a similar experiences that we've had in the past. I'd like to be more optimistic than that, but I really kind of hearken to James. If we are sticking with two candidates that are familiar and already having these kind of very polarizing early polling numbers, I think it's going to be perpetuated what we've seen in the last few cycles.
How do you see that, and this is a general question to everyone on the panel, how do you see that trickling down the ballot? Certainly we have an incredibly polarizing, what appears to be an incredibly polarizing presidential race shaping up. And there are also just a lot of really key races lower down on the ballot. How do you see those dynamics trickling down?
I'll just continue because that's fine. I haven't done first yet, but so the other part of this the other thing that's really great is we just finished a paper called it's called Seeing News, AI and Human-Centered Media Literacies. That's forthcoming. And the super interesting part of the misinformation ecosystem will be kind of the content misinformation, but I'm really curious at how much early adopters are going to tap into emergent AI technologies to see if they can be manipulating voice and that part of it to me will be super interesting. And scary and fascinating all at once as a researcher, and scary as a citizen, and so on and so forth, is how much they will take, kind of manipulation of human actors. So that's a part that I'll be curious to see emerging. And, I think, we tend to focus on the big national election as the barometer. And I do think that's somewhat overstated with misinformation. I do think when it trickles into the more local or regional elections, there's a lot more at stake and there's a lot more danger there. And we spend way less time focusing on that in our narratives. And I think that's really important. I do think it has a bigger impact as you move down into the more local spaces, because there's, we have a hollowing out of people that are actually running. We have so many unelected local offices, which is a huge problem. And part of that problem is because people are disaffected or cynical about the prospects. And I think the misinformation has a far larger potential impact in more local and regional races, when there's fewer voters that are paying attention there, and fewer information channels that it's serving. So I think the potential there is significant.
Great, thanks. All right, so we have a few questions that have come into the chat. The first is builds off of something you said, Ashley. You said something along the lines of abortion access doesn't determine who people will vote for, but it determines whether they will come out and vote or not. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I was like, oh gosh, what did I say?
No,
No, but that is accurate. So what we find, all right. So if you think about the role that abortion plays on ballots now, kind of post-ops, right? If abortion is a direct measure for voters, it's happened in 7 instances. In 7 instances, it's gone in the direction of abortion rights. So what we're seeing is that it's a motivating, primarily Democratic base that is wanting to see some sort of abortion access in their state. And so we know that in instances, we saw this in the 2022 midterms, that places where abortion was on the ballot, like in Michigan, like in Kentucky, it increased Democratic turnout in those states beyond what was predicted if you would have not had abortion on the ballot. So comparable states, and people, so it's motivating Democrats to turn out, and then they're voting for the Democratic candidates, right? Republicans are historically more likely to turn out, especially in midterms elections, and they may be voting for abortion access because a large share of Republicans do want to see some sort of abortion access in the states, but it's not changing which candidates they're voting for, right? So it's not mutually exclusive. They can vote for abortion access and vote for a Republican candidate. Did I kind of explain that better, I think.
That's a really fascinating dynamic. Thank you for unpacking that. Next up is a question about balancing regulating misinformation and protecting free speech. And this is something that keeps me up at night. So the question is, how can misinformation be regulated without violating the First Amendment? And who decides what is disinformation and what is a political campaign's interpretation?
I mean, I can try that one. I mean, I think broadly, questions of who gets to decide or what is allowed are mostly determined by our court system, right? Our constitutional review system. And our courts have pretty consistently ruled that restrictions for free speech have to meet extremely high bars in order to be constitutionally valid. And there's an extra protection for speech that is avowedly political. And so as misinformation becomes deeply entwined with political and partisan goals, there's not really a lot that the Congress will ever do, of course, right? Because the First Amendment restricts Congress shall pass no law regulating the freedom of speech. So in terms of governmental regulations, I don't think that there's really any, there's a very limited role, I think, that the government will be allowed to engage in when it comes to regulating misinformation. And I think that this kind of ties a little bit into what Paul was saying earlier about that it's really the roles of these media organizations, legacy media organizations, social media organizations, and that their decisions on how to platform or deplatform this type of speech will probably have a larger impact. But generally speaking, I think from my perspective, there's not a lot that the government can, will, or even should, maybe should do here. But I thought I would just launch that because no one was going to answer, and then maybe someone else can add on a little bit more of a nuanced point.
Well, while you all think, I will pose one final question from the audience that intersects with questions of free speech a bit. What do you think a reinstatement of the fairness doctrine might do in respect to reducing misinformation? And why is this not being discussed in Congress right now?
This is a tough question. So I think just on top of James, we have, I think if you look to other countries and it's just so complicated because first of all, we have to define what these big tech, where the, news companies have opted into these large social and technology companies, and we have to define what those are. So there are a lot of other efforts outside of the United States where people are trying to regulate rights to information, speech that's harmful. In the United States, we normally default to what James was talking about. So it's really hard to do that. We have had regulatory bodies in the past, and the fairness doctrine is how many years old now? It's got to be 80. It's probably from 1950 or something like that. And it's, it's a monopoly. So we've had this doctrine. We had the Telecommunications Act that was supposed to be protecting the rights of markets to broadcast, and you needed 2 newspapers and 2 radio stations, and no one could own everything. Over time, those regulations have been, with most everything else, there's been like a slow deregulation all the way up to the net neutrality, act being reversed a couple of years ago. So there's not been much will to regulate these spaces. And I think partly because there's the boundaries for what we consider news outlets and media outlets and personal and public communication, right, has disintegrated, and there hasn't been a will. Those are very thorny issues, and they do contrast very much with the First Amendment, when we've lost that kind of the boundaries for these are companies that produce news. They are trusted public institutions, supposedly, so we will make sure that there's some fairness across what they can do and how. That's all been, I think, kind of obfuscated now. So there's not a real will. And in general, we haven't been regulating much as a nation. So I don't think we're going to turn back the clock on the media. It's really, when it gets that close to the First Amendment, it becomes something that's very kind of core to who we are as a nation and those values that people uphold. If I did
I'm-
okay with that one, if other people have ideas. I just
Yeah.
No, I'm,
Ashley, go ahead, please.
no, I'm completely avoiding that question and going to take my prerogative to kind of pivot back to Paul, because I have this question about this local news kind of this hyper investment in local news and hyper local news. And I think it's great. We know that local news is the most trusted source of information. We get that over and over in our any type of survey we do on this. But then I'm like, how many of you are actually watching local news or actually getting local news? Which is really interesting. But I also worry about places where they may be reinvesting in local news. If there is disparity there among communities, especially communities of color, which we know are the groups that are being most impacted, especially in the health space around misinformation. And I'm just now worried, this is great, but is this going to even exacerbate the problems that we're seeing around this space?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I can just pivot there quickly. So some towns for sure, it's not all the some towns are socioeconomic in the middle. Towns like I don't know, Meg would know this. Towns like Ipswich and New Bedford, they aren't high socioeconomic towns, but they're not at the bottom. They're somewhere in the middle. They're somewhat diverse. I don't know. They have means, right? Then there's towns that are at the top. But there is there are a lot of initiatives to support this. So, the 500 million that's kind of gone in to invest in this model, it has to have clear alignment with equity and inclusion and representation of marginalized communities. So there is investments, it like anything, like the investment is but there are communities that are more diverse that are starting this, places like Lynn and Revere that have early inklings to this. These are Massachusetts towns. I don't know if anyone knows these, but so I would say that yes, resource towns have a little bit easier. It's people willing to find local business to invest in, but there is public investment going in to try to see if you can be across different socioeconomic spectrums.
And I'll just add before I turn things over to Tracy, because we are almost at time. Ashley, you bring up one of my core worries about local news sustainability. I do a lot of work on diversity in media ownership, as do a number of my colleagues. And I just dropped a link in the chat to an article in Neiman Lab featuring my colleague Meredith Clark and a collaborator of hers that calls out philanthropic funding for not supporting enough BIPOC founders and media owners. And it was a real call to action. And just to loop it back, Ashley, I think it goes to the points that you were making about a lack of trust in historically marginalized communities. There are a lot of really good reasons, valid reasons for communities of color to not trust mainstream media. And so if we're going to be reinvesting for all of the reasons we've talked about today in efforts to rebuild trust, I think it's important that we do it mindfully. So this was a fabulous panel. My head's going in a million different interdisciplinary directions. So this was a really real treat for me to be able to moderate. Thank you to our participants for asking some really great, tough questions. And I'm going to turn things back over to Tracy to wrap up. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Meg, for moderating this amazing discussion, and James, Ashley, and Paul for joining in today to talk about this. Thank you to all of the attendees for coming to our NEPOR webinar. And I just want to put a plug in for our student paper competition. So if you have any students, undergraduate or graduates who are interested in putting a paper out on public opinion research, NEPOR has a competition open until December, and you can get that paper in, and we will fund your trip to APOR, and you get a slot on the to present. So thank you again to all of our panelists. You were amazing. This was a wonderful discussion. I've got so many questions that have come out of it. Thank you again. Have a great afternoon, everybody.